The name Duke was a peculiar one for a man born not in the gilded halls of European aristocracy, but in the humid, sprawling tobacco fields of eastern Tennessee. Alistair Beaumont, however, wore the title with an unearned yet unshakable confidence. It wasn't a title of nobility, of course, but a nickname bestowed upon his great-grandfather, a man whose ambition and ruthlessness had carved out a veritable kingdom from the rugged Appalachian landscape. The Beaumont family owned the largest tobacco plantation in the county, a sprawling estate of emerald leaves and dark, curing barns that filled the air for miles with a rich, cloying scent. They weren't just wealthy, they were the local sovereigns, their influence woven into the very fabric of the small, isolated community of Havenwood. In the year 1900, Alistair, the current patriarch, was a man in his late 50s, his face a roadmap of hard-won battles and inherited arrogance. He was tall and gaunt, with eyes the color of a stormy sky that seemed to look right through people, assessing their worth with a cold, calculating gaze. He was known as the Duke, and his word was law. But the true heart of the Beaumont dynasty, the dark, beating center of their insular world, lay not with Alistair, but with his twin children, Julian and Juliana. Born within minutes of each other on a sweltering summer night, Julian and Juliana were as alike as two sides of the same tarnished coin. They shared the same pale, almost translucent skin, the same unsettlingly intelligent silver eyes, and the same raven-black hair that curled at their temples. As children, they were inseparable, a two-headed creature that moved with a singular purpose. They spoke in a language of their own, a mixture of hushed whispers and shared glances that excluded everyone, even their own parents. The servants on the Beaumont estate would often speak of them in hushed tones, their stories laced with a mixture of awe and unease. They would tell of how the twins could finish each other's sentences, how they seemed to know what the other was thinking before a word was spoken. As they grew into adulthood, their bond didn't weaken, it intensified, twisting into something that defied easy definition. Julian was the more outgoing of the two, his charm a weapon he wielded with a practiced ease. He was handsome, with a sharp jawline and a smile that could disarm the most hardened of souls. But beneath the polished veneer, there was a cruelty, a casual disregard for the feelings of others that was as chilling as a winter wind. Juliana, on the other hand, was the shadow to his light. She was ethereally beautiful, with a quiet, watchful presence that made people uncomfortable. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her words were a strange mixture of profound insight and unsettling observations. They lived in a world of their own making, a world confined to the sprawling Gothic mansion that sat atop a hill overlooking the tobacco fields. The house, known as Blackwood Manor, was a monument to the Beaumont family's ambition and their isolation. It was a labyrinth of long, dark corridors, of rooms filled with heavy, dust-covered furniture and portraits of ancestors with cold, unforgiving eyes. It was here, within the suffocating confines of Blackwood Manor, that the seeds of the Beaumont madness were sown. The whispers began in earnest when the twins were in their late teens. There were stories of their late-night wanderings through the woods that bordered the estate, of strange, ritualistic games played under the light of the full moon. There were rumors of their cruelty to animals, of a cold, detached curiosity that bordered on the sadistic. But these were just whispers, shadows in the corners of a town that was too afraid, or too dependent on the Beaumonts' patronage, to speak out. The event that would forever seal the fate of the Beaumont family, the act that would plunge them into a spiral of darkness from which there was no return, occurred on the night of Julian and Juliana's 21st birthday. Alistair, in a grand display of his wealth and power, threw a lavish ball, inviting everyone of consequence from the surrounding counties. The ballroom of Blackwood Manor was a dazzling spectacle of crystal chandeliers, of silks and satins, of champagne and laughter. But amidst the gaiety, there was a palpable tension, a sense of foreboding that hung in the air like the scent of an approaching storm. Julian and Juliana, dressed in matching black attire that made their pale skin seem almost luminous, were the center of attention. They moved through the crowd with a graceful, predatory air, their silver eyes scanning the room, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. They danced with an unnerving synchronicity, their bodies moving as one, their gazes locked in a silent conversation that excluded the entire world. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew stranger, more charged. The laughter became a little too loud, the smiles a little too fixed. And then, at the stroke of midnight, Alistair Beaumont made an announcement that would send a shockwave of disbelief and horror through the assembled guests. He stood on the grand staircase, a glass of champagne in his hand, a triumphant, almost manic glint in his eyes. "My friends," he boomed, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom, "tonight we celebrate not only the birth of my beloved children, but also the dawn of a new era for the Beaumont family. Tonight I am proud to announce the betrothal of my son, Julian, to my daughter, Juliana." A stunned silence fell over the room. The music stopped, the laughter died, and all eyes turned to the twins, who stood in the center of the dance floor, their hands entwined, their faces a mask of serene, almost beatific calm. They looked at each other, a slow, knowing smile spreading across their lips. It was a smile that spoke of a shared secret, of a bond that transcended the boundaries of convention, of a love that was as beautiful as it was monstrous. The guests, their faces a mixture of confusion, disgust, and fear, began to back away, to whisper amongst themselves. But Alistair, oblivious or simply indifferent to their reaction, raised his glass in a toast. "To the future of the Beaumont dynasty," he declared, his voice ringing with a mad prophetic fervor. "A dynasty of pure blood, of unshakable power, of a love that will endure for all time." And as the guests began to flee, to escape the suffocating madness of Blackwood Manor, the twins, Julian and Juliana, sealed their unholy union with a kiss. It was a kiss that was both passionate and perverse, a kiss that tasted of forbidden fruit and the sweet, cloying scent of decay. It was a kiss that would plunge the Beaumont family into a darkness from which they would never emerge, a kiss that would create a dynasty of madness that would haunt the hills of Tennessee for generations to come. The days following the announcement were a blur of hushed whispers and scandalized gossip that spread through Havenwood like wildfire. The townsfolk, who had always viewed the Beaumonts with a mixture of fear and grudging respect, were now united in their condemnation. The local preacher, a fire and brimstone Baptist named Reverend Miller, delivered a sermon that all but named the Beaumonts as agents of the devil, his voice thundering from the pulpit as he spoke of sin and damnation. But the condemnation of the outside world meant nothing to the inhabitants of Blackwood Manor. They had always lived in a world of their own making, a world where their own desires were the only laws that mattered. Alistair, his mind consumed by a twisted obsession with preserving the purity of the Beaumont bloodline, saw the union of his twin children not as a transgression, but as a stroke of genius, a way to ensure that the family's legacy would remain untainted by the inferior blood of outsiders. The wedding, if it could be called that, was a small, private affair held in the grand, dust-choked library of Blackwood Manor. There were no guests, no music, no flowers. The only witnesses were Alistair, his face a mask of triumphant pride, and a handful of terrified servants who had been coerced into attending. Julian and Juliana stood before the fireplace, its marble mantel carved with the Beaumont family crest, and exchanged vows that they had written themselves, vows that spoke of an eternal, unbreakable bond that defied the laws of God and man. Their life as a married couple was a continuation of the strange, insular existence they had always known. They rarely left the confines of the estate, content to spend their days wandering through the overgrown gardens or reading in the library, their chairs pulled so close together that their shoulders touched. They seemed to exist in a state of perpetual blissful harmony, their love for each other a self-contained universe that admitted no outsiders. But beneath the surface of this idyllic picture, a darker reality was beginning to take shape. The servants, who had always been privy to the family's secrets, began to notice a change in the twins. Their already eccentric behavior became more pronounced, their moods more volatile. There were stories of Juliana's sudden, inexplicable fits of weeping, of Julian's violent outbursts of rage over the slightest provocation. They would often be seen walking hand in hand through the tobacco fields at night, their laughter echoing eerily through the darkness, a sound that was both childlike and deeply unsettling. The first tangible sign of the madness that was to come appeared about a year after their marriage. Juliana, who had always been slender, began to grow frail, her already pale skin taking on a translucent, almost ghostly quality. She would spend her days locked in her room, refusing to see anyone, even Julian. Her once beautiful singing voice was replaced by a series of strange, guttural sounds that seemed to emanate from the very depths of her soul. Julian, in turn, became more possessive, more paranoid. He would spend hours pacing the corridors of Blackwood Manor, his silver eyes darting back and forth as if he were expecting an attack from some unseen enemy. He began to carry a silver-handled cane with him at all times, a cane that he would use to strike out at anyone who dared to get too close to him or his sister-wife. The servants, their fear growing with each passing day, began to leave one by one their stories of the goings-on at Blackwood Manor, adding to the growing legend of the Beaumont family's madness. They spoke of Juliana's visions, of her claims that she could see the ghosts of their ancestors, their cold, judgmental eyes following her every move. They spoke of Julian's obsession with alchemy, of his late-night experiments in the locked room in the cellar, of the strange, acrid smells that would emanate from under the door. Alistair, for his part, seemed oblivious to the encroaching darkness. He was a man consumed by his own delusions of grandeur, his mind a twisted landscape of ambition and paranoia. He saw the strange behavior of his children not as a sign of their deteriorating mental state, but as a manifestation of their superior Beaumont blood, a sign that they were evolving into something more than human. The birth of Julian and Juliana's first child, a boy they named Alistair II in honor of his grandfather, was a cause for celebration at Blackwood Manor. But the child, from the moment he was born, was a source of unease. He was a small, frail creature, with the same pale skin and silver eyes as his parents. But there was something else, something in his gaze that was both ancient and deeply unsettling. He rarely cried, but when he did, it was a high, keening wail that seemed to echo the sound of Juliana's own strange utterances. As the years passed, the dynasty of madness that Alistair had so proudly proclaimed began to take shape. Julian and Juliana had two more children, a girl named Seraphina and another boy named Lucius. Like their older brother, they were strange, otherworldly creatures, their beauty marred by an underlying sense of wrongness. They were prone to fits of violent rage, followed by long periods of catatonic silence. They spoke in the same strange, private language as their parents, their whispers filling the long, dark corridors of Blackwood Manor with a constant, unnerving hum. The Beaumont children were raised in almost complete isolation, their only companions their parents and their increasingly senile grandfather. They were taught to believe that they were a special, chosen people, that the outside world was a dangerous, inferior place that was to be avoided at all costs. They were raised on a diet of their family's twisted history, a history that was filled with tales of their ancestors' greatness, of their ruthlessness, of their unwavering belief in the purity of their own blood. The madness of the Beaumont family was no longer a secret. It was a well-known fact, a local legend that was told and retold in the taverns and on the porches of Havenwood. The townsfolk, their fear mixed with a morbid curiosity, would often drive by the gates of Blackwood Manor, hoping to catch a glimpse of the strange, reclusive family that lived within. But the gates were always closed, the curtains always drawn, the house a silent, brooding presence on the hill, a monument to a dynasty that was slowly, but surely, consuming itself from within. The woods that bordered the Beaumont estate were a place of deep, primordial mystery. They were a tangled labyrinth of ancient oaks and towering pines, their branches so thick that they blocked out the sun, creating a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. The townsfolk of Havenwood avoided the woods, their imaginations filled with stories of strange creatures and vengeful spirits that were said to dwell within its shadowy depths. But for the Beaumont children, the woods were a sanctuary, a place where they could escape the suffocating confines of Blackwood Manor and indulge in their own strange, private world. Alistair II, Seraphina, and Lucius, now in their early teens, were a sight to behold. They were all tall and slender, with the same pale skin, raven-black hair, and unsettling silver eyes as their parents. But the years of inbreeding had begun to take their toll. Their features were a little too sharp, their limbs a little too long, their movements a little too jerky. There was a fragile, almost brittle quality to their beauty. like a porcelain doll that was about to shatter. They would spend their days wandering through the woods, their bare feet silent on the moss-covered ground. They had a strange, almost preternatural connection to the natural world. They could identify every plant, every animal, every bird by its call. They seemed to be in constant communication with the woods, their whispers and gestures a part of a larger, unseen conversation. It was during these excursions into the woods that the children's own particular brand of madness began to manifest itself. They would engage in strange, ritualistic games, their rules known only to them. They would build elaborate, almost architectural structures out of fallen branches and stones, structures that seemed to serve no practical purpose, but that were filled with a strange, symbolic meaning. They would often be seen dancing in a circle, their movements a strange, hypnotic ballet, their voices raised in a wordless, chanting song that would echo through the trees. The servants who still remained at Blackwood Manor, a small, loyal group who had been with the family for years, would often speak of the children's strange connection to the woods. They would tell of how the children would return from their wanderings with their clothes torn and their skin scratched, their eyes glowing with a strange, feverish light. They would bring back strange offerings from the woods, a perfectly preserved bird's skull, a handful of smooth black stones, a branch that had been twisted into a grotesque, almost human shape. One of the most disturbing stories was of the children's funerals. They would find a dead animal, a squirrel, a rabbit, a bird, and give it a proper burial, complete with a makeshift coffin and a small wooden cross. But their funerals were not a solemn affair. They were a strange, almost joyous celebration of death, their laughter echoing through the woods as they lowered the small creature into the ground. As they grew older, their games became more elaborate, more macabre. They began to build a village of sorts, deep in the heart of the woods. It was a strange, twisted reflection of the world they had never known, a world of their own making. They built small, crude huts out of mud and branches, and populated them with dolls that they had made themselves, dolls with button eyes and stitched-on smiles that were both childlike and deeply unsettling. They would spend hours in their village, acting out elaborate, often violent dramas with their dolls. They would stage mock battles, their high-pitched voices a cacophony of war cries and death rattles. They would hold mock trials, their dolls accused of all sorts of imagined crimes, their sentences always the same, a swift, brutal execution. It was during one of these trials that a young farmhand, a boy named Thomas, who had been sent to deliver a message to Blackwood Manor, stumbled upon the children's secret village. He had gotten lost in the woods and had followed the sound of their voices, thinking he had found his way back to civilization. But what he found was something else entirely, something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He saw the three Beaumont children, their faces smeared with mud, their eyes glowing with a strange feral light. They were standing in a circle around a small wooden stake, to which they had tied one of their dolls. Seraphina was holding a lit torch, her face a mask of ecstatic glee. Alistair the Nen was chanting in a low, guttural voice, his words a strange, incomprehensible litany. And Lucius, the youngest, was holding a small, sharp knife, his hand trembling with a mixture of excitement and fear. Thomas watched in horror as Seraphina lowered the torch, setting the doll ablaze. The children let out a triumphant cheer as the flames consumed the small cloth figure, their laughter a chilling, inhuman sound that echoed through the silent woods. Thomas, his heart pounding in his chest, turned and fled, his mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. He ran until his lungs burned, until he had escaped the suffocating darkness of the woods and found his way back to the familiar, sunlit world of Havenwood. He told his story to anyone who would listen, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. But his story was just one more chapter in the growing legend of the Beaumont family's madness. One more piece of a puzzle that no one could or wanted to fully comprehend. The Whispering Woods, once a place of mystery and superstition, was now a place of tangible, terrifying reality, a place that was inextricably linked to the dark, twisted world of the Beaumont family. Alistair Beaumont, the man who had orchestrated the unholy union of his twin children, was now a shell of his former self. The years had not been kind to him. His once sharp mind had been dulled by a combination of age, alcohol, and the slow, insidious creep of his own inherited madness. He spent his days in his study, a dark wood-paneled room that smelled of old books and stale cigar smoke. He would sit for hours in his leather armchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes staring blankly at the portrait of his wife, a beautiful, sad-eyed woman who had died years ago, some said of a broken heart. He was a man haunted by the ghosts of his past, by the choices he had made, by the dynasty of madness he had so proudly created. He had wanted to create a legacy, to ensure that the Beaumont name would live on for generations to come. But he had created a monster, a family that was a twisted, grotesque parody of his own ambition. His relationship with his children, Julian and Juliana, had deteriorated over the years. They no longer sought his counsel, no longer treated him with the respect that he felt he was due. They saw him as a relic of a bygone era, a man whose time had passed. They were the new masters of Blackwood Manor, their word the new law. Alistair would often wander the long, dark corridors of the house at night, his footsteps a slow, shuffling rhythm that echoed through the silence. He would stop outside his children's bedroom, his ear pressed against the door, listening to their hushed whispers, their strange, intimate language that he could not understand. He would hear their laughter, a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying, a sound that seemed to mock him, to exclude him from their perfect, self-contained world. He was a prisoner in his own home, a king who had been deposed by his own offspring. He was a man who had sown the seeds of madness and was now reaping the bitter harvest. His grandchildren, the strange, otherworldly children of his own children, were a source of both fascination and revulsion for him. He saw in them the culmination of his grand experiment, the living embodiment of his twisted vision. But he also saw in them a reflection of his own damnation, a reminder of the sin he had committed, of the natural order he had so arrogantly defied. He would often watch them from his study window as they played in the overgrown gardens, their movements so graceful, so strange, so unlike the clumsy, boisterous play of normal children. He would see them talking to the flowers, to the trees, to the birds, their voices a soft, melodic hum that seemed to be a part of the natural world. But he also saw the darkness in them, the same darkness that he saw in their parents, the same darkness that he knew lurked in the depths of his own soul. One evening, as he was sitting in his study, a sudden violent storm erupted, the thunder rattling the windows of the old house. The power went out, plunging the manor into a thick, inky blackness. Alistair, his hand trembling, lit a candle and made his way out of the study, the flickering flame casting long dancing shadows on the walls. He found his grandchildren in the grand ballroom, their faces illuminated by the flashes of lightning that lit up the sky. They were dancing, their movements a strange, hypnotic ballet that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. They were dancing to a music that only they could hear, a music that seemed to emanate from the storm itself. Alistair stood in the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched as they twirled and leaped, their bodies moving with a preternatural grace. He saw in their dance a celebration of their own strangeness, a defiance of the world that had rejected them, a world that they had never known. And then, as a particularly loud clap of thunder shook the house to its foundations, they stopped. They turned to him, their silver eyes glowing in the candlelight, their faces a mask of serene, almost beatific calm. They looked at him not with the love and affection that a grandchild should have for their grandfather, but with a cold, detached curiosity, as if he were a strange, interesting specimen that they were observing. In that moment, Alistair Beaumont finally understood the true nature of the legacy he had created. He had not created a dynasty of power, of purity, of eternal love. He had created a dynasty of madness, a family of beautiful, broken creatures who were destined to live and die in the shadows, their lives a strange, tragic symphony of their own making. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound that was both a sob and a laugh. He turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He walked back to his study, to his whiskey, to the ghosts of his past. He was a man who had played God and had lost. He was a king who had been dethroned, a patriarch who had been cast into the shadows. He was a man who was alone in a house that was filled with the echoes of his own damnation. Julian Beaumont, now a man in his early 40s, had grown into a figure of both charm and menace. His youthful handsomeness had hardened into a more severe aristocratic beauty, his silver eyes holding a depth of knowledge and a hint of cruelty that could be both alluring and terrifying. He had assumed the role of the patriarch of Blackwood Manor with a natural, almost effortless grace, his authority absolute and unquestioned. But beneath the polished exterior, Julian's own particular brand of madness had taken root and flourished. He had developed a secret obsession, a passion that he pursued with the same single-minded intensity that had defined his relationship with his sister. Julian had become a collector. His collection was not of art or books, or any of the other things that men of his station were expected to covet. Julian's collection was of a much more macabre nature. He collected things that were on the cusp of death, things that were beautiful in their decay. He had a room in the west wing of the manor, a room that was always kept locked, a room that only he was allowed to enter. It was his sanctuary, his private museum of the grotesque. The room was filled with glass cases, each one containing a different specimen of his strange, macabre art. There were butterflies with their wings pinned to velvet, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to their lifeless forms. There were birds' nests, their delicate, intricate construction a testament to a life that had long since flown away. There were flowers, their petals preserved in a state of perpetual, wilting beauty. But his collection was not limited to the natural world. Julian had also begun to collect things that were more personal, more intimate. He had a collection of his wife's hair, each lock tied with a black ribbon and labeled with the date it was cut. He had a collection of his children's baby teeth, each one stored in a small, velvet-lined box. He had a collection of his father's old love letters to his mother, their ink faded and their pages brittle with age. His obsession with collecting was a way for him to exert control over a world that he felt was constantly slipping away from him. It was a way for him to preserve the beauty of things that were destined to fade, to capture a moment in time and hold it forever in his grasp. It was a way for him to cheat death, to create a world of his own making, a world where he was the ultimate arbiter of life and death. His family, for the most part, was oblivious to the extent of his obsession. Juliana, lost in her own world of visions and whispers, was content to let her husband have his secrets. His children, their minds already a twisted landscape of their own strange realities, saw their father's collection as just another one of the many eccentricities that defined their family. But there was one person who knew the true extent of Julian's madness, one person who had seen the darkness that lurked beneath his charming exterior. Her name was Mary, and she was one of the few remaining servants at Blackwood Manor. She was a young, timid woman who had come to the manor as a girl and had stayed on out of a mixture of loyalty and fear. Mary had stumbled upon Julian's secret room one day by accident. She had been cleaning the west wing and had found the door unlocked. Her curiosity had gotten the better of her, and she had peeked inside. What she saw had filled her with a sense of both fascination and revulsion. She had seen the rows of glass cases, the strange, beautiful, and terrifying objects that they contained. She had seen the look in Julian's eyes as he stood over his collection, a look of pure, unadulterated obsession. From that day on, Mary lived in a state of constant fear. She knew that she had seen something she was not supposed to see, that she was in possession of a secret that could get her killed. She tried to avoid Julian as much as possible, her eyes always downcast when he was in the room. But she could feel his gaze on her, a cold, calculating gaze that seemed to penetrate her very soul. One evening, as Mary was tidying up the library, Julian entered the room. He was holding a small silver box in his hands. He walked over to her, a slow, predatory smile on his face. "Mary," he said, his voice a soft, silken whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. "I have something for you." He opened the box. Inside, on a bed of black velvet, lay a single, perfectly preserved robin's egg, its delicate blue shell a stark contrast to the darkness of the box. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his eyes never leaving her face. "It's a perfect specimen, so fragile, so full of potential. But now, it will never hatch. It will stay like this forever, a perfect, unchanging thing of beauty." Mary looked at the egg and then at Julian's face. She saw in his eyes a reflection of his own twisted soul, a soul that was obsessed with death, with decay, with the preservation of a beauty that was meant to be fleeting. She saw in his smile a promise of a similar fate, a fate that was both terrifying and strangely alluring. She knew in that moment that she had to escape. She had to leave Blackwood Manor, to leave the Beaumont family and their dynasty of madness behind. She had to run and never look back. But as she looked into Julian's silver eyes, she felt a strange, paralyzing sense of calm. She felt as if she were a butterfly pinned to a velvet board, a perfect specimen in his macabre collection. She felt as if she were a part of his world, a world where death was not an end, but a beginning. A world where beauty and decay were two sides of the same tarnished coin, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she would never leave. She was a part of his collection now, a part of the madness that was Blackwood Manor. Juliana, the other half of the unholy union, had descended into a world of her own making, a world of visions and whispers that was both a torment and a comfort to her. Her physical beauty, once so ethereal and captivating, had begun to fade, replaced by a frail, almost skeletal fragility. Her silver eyes, once so bright and intelligent, were now clouded with a perpetual dreamlike haze. She was a ghost in her own home, a beautiful, broken oracle who spoke in riddles and prophecies that only she could understand. She spent her days in the conservatory, a glass-walled room that was filled with exotic, overgrown plants. The air in the conservatory was thick and humid, the scent of damp earth and decaying flowers a constant, cloying presence. It was a place that was both alive and dying, a perfect reflection of Juliana's own state of being. She would sit for hours in a wicker chair, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes staring at the tangled mess of vines and flowers that pressed against the glass. She would talk to the plants, her voice a soft, melodic whisper that was often drowned out by the sound of the wind rattling the glass panes. She would tell them her secrets, her fears, her hopes. She would ask them for guidance, for a glimpse into the future that she felt was always just beyond her grasp. Her visions came to her in flashes, in fragmented images that were both beautiful and terrifying. She would see a river of blood flowing through the tobacco fields, a flock of blackbirds circling the manor, a single white rose blooming in the dead of winter. She would see the faces of her ancestors, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and condemnation. She would see the faces of her children, their futures a tangled web of darkness and despair. She would often try to communicate her visions to her family, but her words were a jumble of metaphors and symbols that they could not comprehend. She would speak of the weeping willow that drinks the tears of the moon, of the serpent that coils around the heart of the sun, of the 3 ravens that will bring the news of the end. Her family, for the most part, dismissed her ramblings as the product of a sick mind. They saw her as a beautiful, tragic figure, a broken doll that was to be pitied but not taken seriously. But there was one person who listened to her, one person who believed in the power of her visions. Her daughter, Serafina, was a mirror image of her mother, both in her beauty and in her burgeoning madness. She had inherited her mother's sensitivity, her connection to the unseen world, her ability to see the patterns and meanings that were hidden from the eyes of others. Serafina would spend hours with her mother in the conservatory, listening to her prophecies, her mind a fertile ground for the seeds of her mother's madness. She would try to decipher her mother's cryptic words, to find the hidden truths that lay beneath their poetic surface. She saw her mother not as a madwoman, but as a prophet, an oracle who was blessed or cursed with the ability to see the future. One afternoon, as a storm was gathering on the horizon, Juliana had a particularly vivid vision. She saw a man, a stranger, coming to Blackwood Manor. He was a man with a kind face and a gentle smile, a man who brought with him the promise of a different life, a life outside the suffocating confines of the Beaumont family. She saw him reaching out his hand to Serafina, his eyes filled with a love that was pure and untainted by the darkness that surrounded them. But she also saw the darkness that followed him, the shadow of her husband, Julian, his face a mask of jealous rage. She saw the flash of a silver blade, the glint of a silver-handled cane. She saw a single white rose, its petals stained with a drop of blood. She tried to warn Serafina, her voice a frantic, desperate whisper. "The white rose will bloom," she said, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "But the serpent will strike. the serpent with the silver eyes. He will not let her go. He will not let any of us go. Serafina listened to her mother's words, a shiver of both fear and anticipation running down her spine. She did not fully understand her mother's prophecy, but she knew that it was a warning, a glimpse into a future that was both beautiful and terrifying. She knew that a change was coming, a change that would either save them or destroy them all. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, Serafina looked out at the darkening sky, her heart a mixture of hope and dread. She saw in the distance a single white rose, its petals still closed, waiting for the right moment to bloom. And she saw in the shadows of the conservatory the glint of her father's silver eyes, watching her, always watching her, a serpent coiled and ready to strike. The arrival of Dr. Thomas Blackwood was an event of such unprecedented normalcy that it felt to the inhabitants of Blackwood Manor like an intrusion from another dimension. He was a distant cousin, a branch of the family tree that had, generations ago, wisely chosen to distance itself from the increasingly eccentric and insular Beaumonts of Tennessee. A man of science and reason, Thomas was a physician from Boston, a city that was a world away from the humid, superstitious atmosphere of Havenwood. He had come to Tennessee to settle the estate of his recently deceased father, and had decided, out of a sense of familial duty and a healthy dose of morbid curiosity, to pay a visit to his long-lost relatives. He had heard the stories, of course, the whispers and rumors that had traveled all the way to the hallowed halls of Harvard Medical School. But he was a man who believed in a rational explanation for everything, a man who saw madness not as a curse, but as a disease of the mind, a puzzle to be solved. His arrival at Blackwood Manor was met with a mixture of suspicion and fascination. He was a man of the modern world, a man who dressed in well-tailored suits and spoke with a crisp, educated accent. He was a stark contrast to the Beaumonts, with their faded, aristocratic grandeur and their strange, otherworldly air. Julian, ever the charming and gracious host, welcomed him with a smile that was both warm and predatory. He saw in Thomas a potential new piece for his collection, a specimen of the outside world that he could study, and perhaps corrupt. Juliana, in her perpetual dreamlike state, seemed not to notice his presence at all. Alistair, his mind a fog of whiskey and regret, greeted him with a grunt and a suspicious glare. But it was the children, or rather, the young adults, who were most affected by his arrival. Alistair II and Lucius, with their feral, untamed energy, watched him from a distance, their silver eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. They saw him as a threat, an intruder who had come to disrupt the delicate, twisted balance of their world. Serafina, on the other hand, was captivated. She had never met a man like Thomas before. He was kind, he was intelligent, he was normal. He spoke to her not as if she were a strange, broken creature, but as if she were a person, a woman with thoughts and feelings of her own. He asked her about her life, about her dreams, about the books she had read. He listened to her with a genuine interest, his eyes free of the pity and condescension that she was so used to seeing. For the first time in her life, Serafina felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of a world beyond the suffocating confines of Blackwood Manor. She began to spend more and more time with Thomas, showing him the overgrown gardens, the dusty library, the hidden corners of the house that had been her only companions for so long. She found herself opening up to him, telling him things that she had never told anyone before. She told him about her mother's visions, about her brother's strange games in the woods, about her father's secret collection. Thomas listened to her stories with a mixture of professional detachment and growing concern. He saw in the Beaumont family a textbook case of inherited psychosis, a tragic example of the devastating effects of inbreeding and isolation. He saw in Serafina a young woman of great intelligence and sensitivity, a woman who was slowly being consumed by the madness that surrounded her. He felt a sense of responsibility for her, a desire to save her from the fate that seemed to be her destiny. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed. Julian, his charm giving way to a cold, simmering jealousy, began to watch them with a hawk-like intensity. He saw in Thomas not a savior, but a rival, a man who was threatening to take away the one thing that he considered to be his most prized possession, his daughter. He began to make subtle threats, his words laced with a veiled menace that was both chilling and unmistakable. Juliana, in her own cryptic way, also seemed to be aware of the changing dynamics in the house. She would often be seen staring at Thomas and Serafina, a strange, knowing smile on her face. She would repeat her prophecy of the white rose, her voice a soft, sing-song whisper that was both a promise and a warning. The tension in Blackwood Manor was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket that was about to be set ablaze. The arrival of Dr. Thomas Blackwood, the man of reason and science, had not brought clarity and order to the Beaumont family. It had brought a spark, a catalyst that was about to ignite the long-simmering madness that lay just beneath the surface of their strange, twisted world. The white rose was about to bloom, and the serpent was coiled and ready to strike. The annual Beaumont Harvest Festival was, in its heyday, a grand affair, a celebration of the family's wealth and power. But in the year 1900, it was a shadow of its former self, a small, private gathering for the family and the few remaining servants who had not yet fled the encroaching madness of Blackwood Manor. It was on the night of this festival, under the light of a full silver moon, that the serpent finally struck. The evening had begun with a tense, almost unbearable civility. Julian, ever the gracious host, was at his most charming, his words a silken web of compliments and veiled threats. He toasted to the harvest, to the family, to their esteemed guest, Dr. Thomas Blackwood. But his eyes, as he raised his glass, were fixed on his daughter, Serafina, who was sitting next to Thomas, their shoulders almost touching, their faces illuminated by the candlelight and a shared, secret smile. Juliana, for her part, was in a state of heightened agitation. She would alternate between long periods of catatonic silence and sudden, frantic bursts of prophecy. She spoke of a coming storm, of a river of blood, of a single white rose that was about to be crushed under the heel of a serpent. Her words, usually dismissed as the ramblings of a madwoman, now held a chilling, prophetic weight. The children, Alistair II and Lucius, were in a particularly feral mood. They had spent the day in the woods and had returned with their faces smeared with mud and their eyes glowing with a strange, feverish light. They sat at the far end of the table, their silence a brooding, menacing presence. As the night wore on, the pretense of civility began to crumble. The wine flowed freely, and the polite conversation gave way to a series of pointed, passive-aggressive remarks. Julian, his jealousy and possessiveness fueled by alcohol, began to openly mock Thomas, questioning his medical knowledge, his city-bred sensibilities, his very manhood. Thomas, for his part, tried to remain calm, to diffuse the situation with reason and logic. But he was out of his element, a man of science in a world of raw, untamed emotion. He saw in Julian's eyes a madness that was beyond his comprehension, a darkness that could not be cured with medicine or therapy. The breaking point came when Serafina, in a moment of youthful rebellion, announced her intention to leave Blackwood Manor. She spoke of her desire to see the world, to go to college, to live a life of her own making. She looked at Thomas as she spoke, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and defiance. Julian's reaction was swift and terrifying. He slammed his fist on the table, the crystal glasses rattling with the force of the blow. His charming facade crumbled, revealing the raw, unadulterated rage that lay just beneath the surface. His face was a mask of fury, his silver eyes blazing with a possessive, almost demonic light. "You are a Beaumont," he hissed, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You will not leave this house. You will not leave me." He turned to Thomas, his hand reaching for the silver-handled cane that was always by his side. "And you," he said, his voice dripping with a cold, murderous contempt. "You will not take her from me." What happened next was a blur of motion and violence. Julian lunged at Thomas, his cane raised high above his head. Thomas, caught off guard, stumbled backward, his chair crashing to the floor. Serafina screamed, her voice a high, piercing shriek that was lost in the ensuing chaos. Alistair II and Lucius, their feral instincts taking over, joined the fray, their movements a blur of animalistic fury. They were on Thomas in an instant, their hands and teeth like the claws and fangs of wild animals. It was a scene from a nightmare, a descent into a primal, brutal madness. The dining room, once a symbol of the Beaumont family's wealth and refinement, was now a battlefield, a stage for a drama of jealousy, rage, and a love that was as beautiful as it was destructive. And through it all, Juliana sat at the head of the table, a strange, serene smile on her face. She watched the chaos unfold, her eyes shining with a prophetic, almost ecstatic light. She had seen it all before, in her visions. The storm had come. The river of blood was beginning to flow. The white rose was being crushed. The serpent had struck. In the midst of the chaos, as her brothers descended upon Thomas like a pair of rabid wolves, Serafina's mind, for a brief, fleeting moment, was a beacon of clarity in a sea of madness. The years of living in the shadow of her family's insanity had, in a strange, twisted way, prepared her for this moment. She knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating that this was her only chance to escape. She grabbed a heavy silver candlestick from the table and, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, brought it down hard on her father's head. Julian, caught off guard by his daughter's sudden act of rebellion, staggered backward, his hand flying to his head, a look of shocked betrayal in his eyes. That moment of hesitation was all she needed. She grabbed Thomas's hand, his face a mask of pain and disbelief, and pulled him towards the door. "We have to go," she screamed, her voice cutting through the cacophony of snarls and grunts. "Now!" They ran, their footsteps echoing through the long, dark corridors of Blackwood Manor. They could hear the sounds of pursuit behind them, the enraged shouts of her father, the animalistic howls of her brothers. They were a pack of wolves, and she and Thomas were their prey. They burst out of the front door and into the cool night air. The full moon, which had earlier seemed so beautiful and serene, now seemed to cast a sinister, almost mocking light on their desperate flight. They ran across the manicured lawns, their feet sinking into the soft, damp earth. They ran towards the woods, the same woods that had been her childhood sanctuary, the same woods that now represented their only hope of escape. They plunged into the darkness of the woods, the branches of the trees scratching at their faces and clothes. Serafina, who knew the woods like the back of her hand, led the way, her movements sure and swift. Thomas, a city man who was completely out of his element, stumbled and fell, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But he held onto her hand, his grip a lifeline in a world that had suddenly turned into a nightmare. They could still hear the sounds of pursuit, closer now, more menacing. They could hear the snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, the low, guttural growls of her brothers. They were closing in, their senses honed by years of living in the wild, their minds consumed by a singular, murderous intent. Serafina led them to a small, hidden cave, its entrance concealed by a thick curtain of ivy. It was a place she had discovered as a child, a place where she would go to escape the suffocating confines of the manor, to dream of a world that was different from her own. It was her secret place, her sanctuary. And now, it was their only hope of survival. They scrambled into the cave, their bodies trembling with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Serafina pulled the ivy back into place, plunging them into a thick, almost absolute darkness. They huddled together in the back of the cave, their hearts pounding in their chests, their breathing a ragged counterpoint to the sounds of the night. They could hear them now, just outside the cave. They could hear their footsteps, their sniffs, their frustrated grunts as they searched for their prey. They could hear their father's voice, a low, menacing whisper that seemed to seep through the very rock of the cave. "Serafina," he called, his voice a mixture of love and rage. "Come out, my love. You can't hide from me. You are a part of me. You will always be a part of me." Serafina pressed herself against the cold, damp wall of the cave, her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sound of his voice, the sound of her own damnation. She looked at Thomas, his face a pale, ghostly image in the darkness. She saw in his eyes a reflection of her own terror, but also a glimmer of something else, something that she had never seen before in a man's eyes, a love that was pure, selfless, and unconditional. They stayed in the cave for what seemed like an eternity, their bodies pressed together, their silence a prayer. They listened as the sounds of pursuit gradually faded away. As the night grew still and quiet once more, they had escaped for now. They had survived the night. But as the first, faint rays of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the ivy, Serafina knew that their ordeal was far from over. They had escaped the physical confines of Blackwood Manor, but they had not escaped the madness that was in their blood. They were still a part of the Beaumont family, a part of the dynasty of madness that had been created by a love that was as beautiful as it was monstrous. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the serpent was not dead. It was merely wounded, and it would be back. The escape of Serafina and Thomas sent a shockwave through the already fractured world of the Beaumont family. It was an act of defiance, a betrayal of the highest order, and it pushed the remaining inhabitants of Blackwood Manor over the edge into a new, more terrifying realm of madness. Julian, his head bandaged and his pride wounded, became a man consumed by a singular obsessive purpose: to find his daughter and bring her back, to punish the man who had stolen her from him. He was a caged animal, pacing the long, dark corridors of the manor, his silver-handled cane a constant menacing presence in his hand. His charm was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering rage that was directed at anyone who crossed his path. He saw betrayal everywhere, in the downcast eyes of the servants, in the rustling of the leaves outside his window, in the very shadows that seemed to mock him with their silence. Juliana, for her part, seemed to have retreated even further into her own private world. Her visions became more vivid, more terrifying. She would spend her days in the conservatory, her voice a constant, nonsensical stream of prophecies and warnings. She spoke of a coming darkness, of a fire that would consume the house, of a final bloody reckoning. But there was a new element to her madness, a note of triumph in her voice. She saw her daughter's escape not as a tragedy, but as a fulfillment of her prophecy, a sign that the cycle of madness could be broken. Alistair II and Lucius, their feral instincts inflamed by the taste of violence, became more and more like the wild animals they had always emulated. They would spend their days in the woods, their hunting games becoming more and more real. They would return to the manor with their clothes torn and their faces smeared with the blood of small animals, their eyes glowing with a strange, predatory light. They were their father's loyal soldiers, his hunting dogs, and they were waiting for his command to be unleashed. The madness of Blackwood Manor, once a secret that was whispered about in the taverns of Havenwood, was now on full display. The few remaining servants, their loyalty finally broken by the events of the Harvest Festival, fled in the middle of the night, their stories of the Beaumont family's descent into a primal, violent madness spreading through the town like a plague. The townsfolk of Havenwood, who had always viewed the Beaumonts with a mixture of fear and awe, were now united in their terror. They locked their doors at night, their imaginations filled with stories of the strange, wild men who roamed the woods, of the mad woman who spoke in tongues, of the vengeful patriarch who was said to be on the hunt for his own daughter. Blackwood Manor, once a symbol of wealth and power, was now a place of fear and superstition. It was a dark, brooding presence on the hill, a place that was said to be cursed, a place that was to be avoided at all costs. The tobacco fields, once the source of the Beaumont family's wealth, were now neglected, the emerald leaves turning yellow and brown, a symbol of the decay that had taken root in the heart of the family. The madness of the Beaumont family was no longer a private affair. It was a public spectacle, a local legend that was becoming more and more real with each passing day. The serpent, wounded and enraged, was no longer content to stay within the confines of its own nest. It was slithering out into the world, its venomous fangs ready to strike at anyone who stood in its way. The dynasty of madness was not just consuming itself from within. It was beginning to spread, to poison the very air of the small Tennessee town that had been its home for so long. Miles away from the suffocating madness of Blackwood Manor, Serafina and Thomas had found a fragile, temporary sanctuary. They had made their way to a small, secluded cabin on the other side of the county, a cabin that belonged to a friend of Thomas's, a fellow doctor who was away on a long trip to Europe. It was a simple, rustic place, a world away from the opulent, decaying grandeur of the manor. It was a place where they could breathe, where they could be, for a brief, fleeting moment, normal. The first few days were a blur of exhaustion and relief. They slept for hours, their bodies and minds recovering from the trauma of their escape. They ate simple meals, their conversations a mixture of hushed whispers and long, comfortable silences. They were two people from two different worlds, brought together by a shared, terrifying experience. But as the days turned into weeks, a new reality began to set in. They were fugitives, living in constant fear of being discovered. Every knock on the door, every unfamiliar sound, sent a jolt of terror through their hearts. They knew that Julian would not give up, that he would use all of his wealth and influence to find them. The madness of Blackwood Manor, Serafina soon realized, was not something that could be easily left behind. It was a part of her, a shadow that followed her wherever she went. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her body drenched in a cold sweat, her mind filled with images of her father's enraged face, of her brother's feral eyes, of her mother's cryptic, prophetic warnings. She was haunted by the ghosts of her past, by the family that she both loved and hated, by the strange, twisted world that had been her only reality for so long. She would often find herself staring at her own reflection in the mirror, searching for signs of the Beaumont madness in her own silver eyes. She was terrified of what she might find, of the darkness that she knew lurked in the depths of her own soul. Thomas, for his part, did his best to be her anchor, her rock in a sea of emotional turmoil. He was a man of science, a man who believed in the power of reason and logic to overcome even the most deeply ingrained of fears. He would hold her when she trembled, listen to her when she spoke of her nightmares, and assure her that she was not her family, that she had the power to choose her own path. But even he, the man of reason, was beginning to feel the weight of their situation. He was a doctor, a man who was used to being in control, to having the answers. But he had no answer for the madness of the Beaumont family, no cure for the disease that was consuming them. He was a man in love with a woman who was beautiful, intelligent, and deeply, tragically broken. And he knew, with a growing sense of dread, that he was in over his head. Their fragile sanctuary was a bubble, a temporary reprieve from a world that was closing in on them. They were two people in a small wooden cabin, their love a flickering candle in a storm that was gathering on the horizon. They were a white rose, blooming in the wilderness, beautiful and fragile and destined to be crushed. The serpent was on the hunt, and it was only a matter of time before it found them. Julian Beaumont, his rage and obsession growing with each passing day, had become a relentless hunter. He had hired a team of private investigators, ruthless men who were not afraid to bend the law to get what they wanted. He had offered a substantial reward for any information leading to the capture of his daughter and the man who had taken her from him. He had plastered their faces on posters that were distributed throughout the state, their images a stark, black and white reminder of their status as fugitives. He had also unleashed his sons, Alistair the Coup and Lucius. They were his hunting dogs, his bloodhounds, their feral instincts and intimate knowledge of the local landscape, making them far more effective than any team of hired guns. They would roam the countryside, their silver eyes scanning the horizon, their senses on high alert for any sign of their prey. They were a terrifying sight, two tall, gaunt figures with the eyes of wolves and the souls of demons. The hunt for Serafina and Thomas became a statewide obsession, a macabre drama that was played out in the pages of the local newspapers and in the hushed whispers of the townsfolk. They were the star-crossed lovers, the beautiful, tragic fugitives who had dared to defy the powerful and dangerous Julian Beaumont. Their story was a mixture of romance and horror, a modern-day fairy tale with a dark, twisted ending. Back in their fragile sanctuary, Serafina and Thomas were living in a state of constant, nerve-wracking suspense. They rarely left the cabin, and when they did, it was under the cover of darkness. They had changed their appearances, Serafina cutting her long, raven-black hair and dyeing it a mousy brown, Thomas growing a thick, untidy beard. They were living on borrowed time, and they knew it. The news of the hunt reached them through the newspapers that Thomas would occasionally risk buying in a neighboring town. Serafina would read the articles with a mixture of fear and a strange, morbid fascination. She saw her life being transformed into a public spectacle, a story that was being told and retold, each version more sensational and less true than the last. She saw her father's words, his lies, his twisted version of the truth, being printed for all the world to see. He had painted her as a mentally unstable young woman who had been abducted by a charismatic, manipulative older man. He had painted himself as the grieving, concerned father who only wanted to bring his beloved daughter home. The weight of her family's legacy, of their madness, was becoming unbearable. She felt as if she were a character in a play that had been written long before she was born, her lines and her fate already decided. She was a Beaumont, and she was beginning to fear that there was no escaping what that meant. The end came on a cold autumn night. The leaves had turned to a brilliant, fiery red, a color that seemed to mock them with its beauty. They were sitting by the fire, their silence a comfortable, familiar presence, when they heard the sound of a twig snapping outside the cabin. They both froze, their eyes meeting in a shared, silent terror. They had been found. The door burst open, and there they were, her brothers, their faces contorted into masks of feral glee, their silver eyes glowing in the firelight. They were no longer boys. They were monsters, the living embodiment of the Beaumont family's madness. And behind them, in the doorway, stood her father, Julian. He was smiling, a slow, triumphant smile that was more terrifying than any expression of rage. He was holding his silver-handled cane, its polished surface glinting in the firelight. "Hello, my love," he said, his voice a soft, silken whisper that sent a shiver of ice down her spine. "It's time to come home." The hunt was over. The hunter had found his prey, the serpent had found the white rose, and it was time for the final bloody act of the Beaumont family's macabre drama to begin. The journey back to Blackwood Manor was a silent, surreal nightmare. Serafina and Thomas were bound and gagged, their hands tied behind their backs. They were forced to sit in the back of a dark, musty carriage, the rhythmic, monotonous sound of the horses' hooves a constant, maddening reminder of their captivity. Julian sat across from them, his face a mask of serene, triumphant calm. He did not speak, but his eyes never left his daughter's face. They were the eyes of a collector who had just reacquired his most prized possession, the eyes of a lover who had been reunited with his beloved, the eyes of a god who had just reclaimed his errant creation. Alistair II and Lucius rode on horseback, flanking the carriage like a pair of demonic outriders. They would occasionally glance back at the carriage, their faces filled with a mixture of childish glee and animalistic savagery. They had done their father's bidding, and they were proud of it. As they approached the gates of Blackwood Manor, a sense of dread, so thick and suffocating that it was almost a physical presence, descended upon Serafina. The house, her childhood home, now looked like a tomb, a dark, brooding mausoleum that was about to swallow her whole. The carriage pulled up to the front door, and the doors of the manor swung open, as if on their own accord. And there, in the doorway, stood her mother, Juliana. She was dressed in a long, white gown, her raven-black hair flowing down her back. She looked like a ghost, a beautiful, tragic specter from a bygone era. She looked at Serafina, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and a strange, prophetic wisdom. "The white rose has returned," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic hum that was both a welcome and a eulogy. "But the serpent's bite is fatal." Serafina and Thomas were dragged out of the carriage and into the house. The air inside was thick and stale, the smell of dust and decay a familiar, suffocating presence. The house was a time capsule, a museum of a family that had been slowly, but surely, consuming itself from within. They were taken to the library, the same room where her parents had been married, the same room where so many of the Beaumont family's dark secrets were hidden. Her father, Alistair, was there sitting in his armchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up as they entered, his eyes a dull, lifeless gray. He seemed to look right through them, as if they were ghosts, as if they were already dead. Julian untied his daughter's hands, his touch a strange mixture of tenderness and menace. He ran his hand through her hair, his fingers lingering on the short brown strands. "We'll have to fix this," he said, his voice a soft, almost loving whisper. "You are a Beaumont. You should look like a Beaumont." He then turned to Thomas, his face a mask of cold, murderous contempt. "And as for you," he said, his voice dripping with a venomous hatred, "you have defiled my property. You have tried to take what is mine, and for that there is a price to be paid." He raised his silver-handled cane, its polished surface glinting in the firelight. Seraphina screamed, her voice a high, piercing shriek that was lost in the ensuing brutal violence. The return to Blackwood Manor was not a homecoming. It was a descent into a hell of their own making, a final, bloody chapter in the dynasty of madness that was the Beaumont family. The White Rose had been brought back to the serpent's nest, and the serpent was about to deliver its final fatal bite. The days that followed were a blur of pain and despair. Thomas was locked in the cellar, his body a canvas of Julian's sadistic artistry. He was beaten, starved, and subjected to a series of psychological tortures that were designed to break his spirit, to erase his very identity. But Thomas, for all his physical suffering, refused to break. He held on to the memory of Seraphina's face, of her love, of the brief, fleeting moments of happiness they had shared. He held on to the hope, however faint, that they could still escape, that their love could still triumph over the madness that surrounded them. Seraphina, for her part, was a prisoner in her own home. She was confined to her room, her every move watched by her brothers, who had become her personal jailers. Julian would visit her every day, bringing her food and clothes and books. He would sit with her for hours, talking to her in a soft, soothing voice, telling her how much he loved her, how much he had missed her, how they could now be a family again, a perfect, self-contained unit, just as it was always meant to be. But his words were a poison, his love a cage. She saw in his eyes not the love of a father, but the obsessive, possessive desire of a collector for his most prized possession. She saw in his smile a promise of a future that was a living death, a future where she would be a beautiful, broken doll in his macabre collection. She knew that she had to do something, that she had to find a way to save Thomas, to save herself. But she was trapped, surrounded by a madness that was as suffocating as it was inescapable. She was a bird with a broken wing, a flower that was slowly but surely wilting in the darkness. Her only ally, in a strange, twisted way, was her mother. Juliana, in her perpetual dreamlike state, seemed to be the only one who understood the true nature of their situation. She would visit Seraphina in her room, her eyes filled with a sad, prophetic wisdom. She would speak in riddles and metaphors, but her words held a hidden meaning, a secret message of hope and defiance. "The serpent is a creature of darkness," she would whisper, her voice a soft, melodic hum. "It cannot survive in the light. The fire that purifies is also the fire that destroys." Seraphina listened to her mother's words, a desperate, audacious plan beginning to form in her mind. It was a plan that was born of a love that was as fierce as it was desperate, a plan that was as mad as the family she was trying to escape. She began to play the part of the dutiful daughter, the prodigal child who had seen the error of her ways. She smiled at her father. She laughed at his jokes. She allowed him to hold her hand. She was a brilliant actress, her performance so convincing that even Julian, in his arrogance and obsession, was fooled. She managed to convince him to let her out of her room, to allow her to walk in the gardens, to visit her mother in the conservatory. She was slowly, but surely, earning his trust, biding her time, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came on a dark, moonless night. The wind was howling outside, rattling the windows of the old house, a perfect soundtrack for the macabre drama that was about to unfold. She had managed to steal a key to the cellar from her father's study and a small, sharp knife from the kitchen. She made her way down to the cellar, her heart pounding in her chest, her hand trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. She found Thomas in a small, damp cell, his body bruised and broken, but his eyes still shining with an unbroken spirit. She unlocked the door, and he stumbled out, his arms wrapping around her in a desperate, grateful embrace. "I knew you would come," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disuse. But their reunion was short-lived. They heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs, the sound of her father's voice calling her name. They had been discovered. Seraphina looked at Thomas, her eyes filled with a love that was both fierce and tragic. "Go," she said, pressing the knife into his hand. "Get out of here. I'll hold them off." Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and protest. "I won't leave you," he said. "You have to," she said, her voice a firm, unwavering command. "You have to live. For both of us." She kissed him, a long, desperate kiss that was both a hello and a goodbye. And then she pushed him towards a small hidden passage that she had discovered as a child, a passage that led out to the woods. As he disappeared into the darkness, she turned to face her father, who was standing at the bottom of the stairs, his face a mask of shocked, murderous rage. She was no longer a victim, a prisoner. She was a warrior, a woman who was fighting for her love, for her life, for her very soul. She was the white rose, and she was about to show the serpent that even a rose has thorns. The fire was about to be lit, and the dynasty of madness was about to be consumed by its own flames. The confrontation in the cellar was a primal, brutal ballet. Julian, his face a mask of enraged betrayal, lunged at his daughter, his silver-handled cane a blur of motion. But Serafina, her senses sharpened by adrenaline and desperation, was ready for him. She ducked and weaved, her movements as graceful and deadly as a cornered animal. She was no longer the timid, frightened girl who had fled Blackwood Manor weeks ago. She was a woman who had been pushed to the brink, a woman who had nothing left to lose. She fought with a ferocity that surprised even herself, her rage a purifying fire that burned away the years of fear and submission. The fight spilled out of the cellar and into the main house, a destructive, chaotic whirlwind that tore through the silent, decaying rooms. They were two sides of the same tarnished coin, the father and the daughter, their love and their hatred a twisted, inseparable knot. Alistair, Secund, and Lucius, drawn by the sounds of the struggle, joined the fray, their feral instincts taking over. But Serafina, her mind a beacon of clarity in a sea of madness, was one step ahead of them. She used her knowledge of the house, of its secret passages and hidden corners, to her advantage. She was a ghost in her own home, a phantom of vengeance that they could not catch. The turning point came in the library, the room where the Beaumont family's dynasty of madness had been officially sanctioned. Julian, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and a strange, twisted love, had managed to corner her. He raised his cane for the final, fatal blow, a triumphant, almost ecstatic gleam in his silver eyes. But in that moment, the library doors burst open, and there stood Juliana, her face a mask of serene, prophetic calm. She was holding a lit candelabra, its flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "The fire that purifies," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic hum that cut through the chaos, "is also the fire that destroys." And with a grace and deliberation that was both beautiful and terrifying, she threw the candelabra into a pile of old, dry books. The flames erupted, a hungry, roaring beast that began to consume everything in its path. The fire spread with a terrifying speed, the old dry wood of the manor a perfect fuel for its destructive rage. The house, which had been a tomb for so long, was now a funeral pyre, a fiery, chaotic inferno that was consuming the Beaumont family and their dynasty of madness. Julian, his face a mask of shocked disbelief, was momentarily distracted by the flames, and in that moment of hesitation, Serafina saw her chance. She grabbed a heavy, leather-bound book from a nearby shelf, and with all her remaining strength, brought it down on her father's head. He staggered backward, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and betrayal, and then fell into the flames, his body consumed by the fire that his own wife had started. Alistair and Lucius, their feral instincts now a liability in the face of the all-consuming fire, were trapped, their howls of terror a chilling, inhuman symphony that was soon silenced by the roar of the flames. Serafina, her body bruised and her lungs filled with smoke, stumbled out of the library and into the arms of her mother. Juliana looked at her, a strange, serene smile on her face. "The white rose has been cleansed by the fire," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic lullaby. And then she turned and walked back into the flames, a willing sacrifice to the fire that she had created. Serafina, her heart a mixture of grief and a strange, liberating relief, stumbled out of the burning house and into the cool night air. She watched as Blackwood Manor, the symbol of her family's wealth, power, and madness, was consumed by the flames, its dark, brooding presence on the hill a fiery, spectacular beacon that could be seen for miles around. She turned and ran, her footsteps a steady, rhythmic beat on the soft, damp earth. She ran towards the woods, towards the hope of a new life, towards the man who was waiting for her on the other side. The fire that destroyed Blackwood Manor was a local legend for years to come, a story that was told and retold in the taverns and on the porches of Havenwood. They said that the fire had been a cleansing, a purification, a final bloody end to the dynasty of madness that had haunted the hills of Tennessee for so long, and they said that sometimes, on a clear, moonless night, you could still see the ghost of a single, white rose, its petals stained with a drop of blood, blooming in the ashes of what was once Blackwood Manor, a beautiful, tragic symbol of a love that was born in the heart of a dynasty of madness, and a fire that had set it free.